You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Dern.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first off-season edition of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I am your host, Kevin Dern. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on DolphinsTalk.com, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. And please follow along with all of the great writers and podcasts that are part of the Dolphins Talk network. And wanted to do a show as I record this the day before the Super Bowl, just kind of detailing some of the things that have gone on so far this Dolphins offseason, and also wanted to kind of include sort of a draft overview since the Senior Bowl and the East-West Shrine game were last week, and wanted to give my thoughts on that. I wanted to record and release this episode a week ago. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away on January 31st, so with all that going on, just delaying everything a week, and here we are. And kind of wanted to set the table by prefacing how I feel about this team going into 2025. The offseason is fast approaching. As I record this, we're about a month and 2 days away from the start of the new league year. So basically a month from the legal tampering period as I record this. And we'll do this preface segment, we'll do the whiskey segment, and then we'll dive into some overarching thoughts on the draft class. And I wanted to be perfectly clear that this season, to me, is dying on the vine. It's either going to get some sort of miraculous rebirth, or this team's just going to die off, and Mr. Ross will have no choice but to start moving on from Grier, McDaniel, Tua after the 2025 season. You know, we got the ridiculous and ill-timed notice right after the end of the season loss to the Jets. We had the embarrassing, rambling, just excuse-laden press conference at the end of the year, which should have been enough of a warning flare for Ross to recant his decision and fire both of those fools. But Grier and McDaniel nonetheless stay in charge of the organization for another year. So overall, I am of the mind that there's really not much success to be had until you start having some semblance of accountability from the top down. And that just hasn't existed. And because of that, and I think largely coming out of the 2019 teardown and the rebuild, in which you had, 5 picks in the first 2 rounds in 2020, only 40% of that is still here, Tua and Austin Jackson, and both of those guys are injured, pretty frequently. And, you look at the subsequent draft, Jaylen Phillips is injured, back-to-back season-ending injuries, Javon Holland. If you watched Mike's podcast or episode earlier, you'll know Josh Moser reported that Javon Holland is basically opening a bidding war. He's going wherever the money's greenest. And good riddance to him if that's the case. He did not play well this past year. But it just shows that the Dolphins, they rebuilt everything in 2019, and the rebuild has failed. And I think you look at this rebuild, and the height of it was going into that road game against Baltimore in Week 17 of 2023. You had a chance, if you won that, to be the number 1 seed. And you got blown out. That was the height of the rebuild, and it's backslid from there. And I think you're to the point now where you're going into your 10th season of Chris Grier as the general manager. You don't have a single playoff win to your name. You don't have a division title to your name. You haven't even sniffed a divisional round. That's contemptibly bad, given how much parity is built into the way the NFL works as a business. Like in any other sport, in any other organization, he would have been gone 2 or 3 years ago. He should be gone just for the sake of change and the way he's built the roster. And we'll come back to that here in a little bit. But because of that, and because you have a head coach in Mike McDaniel who has basically admitted he can't police the locker room culture, he just hasn't been able to build a culture. It's a culture of laziness and a lack of accountability based on what the players have said, from Zach Sealer, Alec Ingold, Bradley Chubb, Teron Armstead, Tyreek Hill himself. Silent in all of this has been Tua. You look at the things with McDaniel. We heard going into his very first year that he had trouble with the administrative stuff, based on my friend's quote from another person in the Shanahan-McVay coaching tree. That's come home to roost tenfold this year. I think it's laid out to bear for everyone to see. The team has trouble getting lined up. They have trouble getting plays in. They have trouble, the quarterback has trouble with the order of operations before the snap. Guys don't know where to line up right. You had Mike Gesicki at one point calling timeouts for Tua because Tua didn't realize they were lined up in illegal formation. It's a bumbling mess of a lot of things. You can talk about timeouts used in just contemptibly stupid situations, after turnovers, after TV timeouts, after the opening kickoff on a game where you received it. How do you not have your script play ready? You talk about the challenges, being 4 out of 23 or whatever McDaniel is. Like, all these processes don't work. And he basically, just Raheem Mostert may or may not have said at some point in an interview this week that he didn't know if the guys would have even have cared if McDaniel got fired or whether he stayed. It's basically the young, hip version of Joe Philbin is what we're dealing with here. It's going to take a hell of an effort to kind of turn the cruise ship around, so to speak, and get things pointed in the right direction. And, even Tua, I think the fan base was generally happy with him getting the big deal, and they loved the whole show me the money clip. But then, not even 7 full quarters into the season, he has a dog shit performance against Buffalo. Didn't really play particularly well against Jacksonville either, and tries to run over Damar Hamlin and knocks himself out for a month. Then he comes back, has the fumbled snap issues, and then he calls out the fan base with the whole bag of chips, eating chips on your couch thing, which is just stupid. And then he gets hurt again in Houston on him scrambling out of the pocket on a play that already had a penalty flag thrown. Like, what are we doing here? And I think all of this combined is you've now got just a team that wasn't likable. And having talked to a number of friends that are Dolphins fans and people who work in different leagues, positions and different teams within the league, it's just kind of the general vibe is that the vibes are bad in Miami. Last year's team wasn't fun. They weren't necessarily likable. You had drama from the very start of the season with Tyreek Hill, in handcuffs before the Week 1 game against Jacksonville. There's just no accountability from the top down, and I don't think that Stephen Ross is overly senile, nor is he completely apathetic. I think he's a businessman, and he believes that stability can turn this thing around, but at this point it's stability for the sake of stability, because you don't have an adult in the room making these ultimate decisions. And what you've generated, and Chris Kaufman from the 3 yards per carry group has a great thread on this, is you basically turn the fan base into the angry mob, or a bunch of hammers as he called it, and they're looking to hit the nail on anything, and they'll turn anything to a nail to satiate the thirst here. And I think the whole press conference and all that just kind of lit flame to the torches, and you've got a fan base that's just sick of it. They're sick of the losing. They're sick of the backslide. They're sick of the lack of accountability. You have an unlikable team on top of all this, and things just don't look very good going into 2025. And to me, that's why this team is sort of dying on the vine. It's either going to get some sort of miraculous turnaround, or it's going to, wither away and die. And I'd bet on the latter. even Wade Garrett showed up at the Double Deuce in Jasper, Missouri, and still ended up dead. And he's supposedly the best cooler in the world. So I don't know who the Dolphins' version of Wade Garrett would be to come in and basically solve the team's problems. I think that ultimately is going to take a new general manager, a new coach, and a new quarterback, in the future to get this right, or at least have the potential to get it right. And, Chris Kaufman's thread was, in coming back to Chris Grier, I was on the Finside the NFL roundtable a couple weeks ago, and I think several people stressed the point that there is talent on the roster, but is it a good roster? That's sort of the question that I have. Let's take this exercise. View us against the Kansas City Chiefs, the AFC champions, back-to-back Super Bowl champions, arguably the greatest team in football at this point. If you look at their roster, the top 3 players, Mahomes, Chris Jones, Travis Kelce, probably better than the 3 top players on the Dolphins roster, however you want to slice it, which last year for me would probably be Teron Armstead when he was on the field, Calais Campbell, and Jordan Brooks. The Dolphins may have players, from slots like 4 to 10 or 4 to 12 even, that are better than Kansas City's. You've got your Jaylen Waddles, your Tyreek Hills, your Jalen Ramseys, Zach Sealer, Tua, Aaron Brewer. But from 12 to 53, the guts and the sinew of the roster, I feel like just about everyone on the Chiefs is better than the Dolphins. And that's what I think I mean when myself and others say, this is a talented roster, but it's not necessarily a good roster. It's not a well-constructed roster. And you look at the overriding ideology kind of stemming from this. Look at where the money is laid. And I promise I'll tie this into the draft. As we know, Chris Grier is a Bill Parcells disciple. Bobby Grier worked for Bill Parcells with the Patriots. Chris started there, then came to the Dolphins. We know the history. But Bill Parcells and those acolytes of his have always put money on the premium positions. Quarterback, pass catchers, meaning receivers, offensive tackles, pass rushers, and corners. You look at the Dolphins now, you have a big contract with Tua at quarterback. You have 2 big contracts at receiver with Hill and Waddle. You've paid Teron Armstead a big contract. You gave Austin Jackson an extension, and you've spent a 2nd-round pick on Patrick Paul. You've given a big contract to Bradley Chubb. You spent a 1st-round pick on Jalen Phillips and another 1st-round pick on Chop Robinson. And oh, by the way, Jalen Phillips is playing on the 5th-year option, which I think is like $20 million for a defensive end. And then at corner, you've given Jalen Ramsey a monster contract, which for a short time was the highest in the league to a corner. You've given Kendall Fuller a mid-sized contract, and you've spent a 2nd-round pick on Cam Smith. They've made investments at these positions. I think the problem is you look at the age and the injury history of these guys at these positions. Tua is a younger guy, 26, but he's had multiple concussions. Now you've got the hip issue circling back up. You've had a broken rib, a punctured lung, a finger. That's not good. Tyreek Hill's 30. Teron Armstead, again, really good player, but he's only given you like 10 to 12 games a year. That's kind of just been his career, and has a whole litany of injuries. Austin Jackson, injured again, and really, since he's been drafted in 2020, has only given you 1 year of good play throughout the entire season. That's 2023. Patrick Paul, we'll see on that. Kind of too early to kind of give a rating. Bradley Chubb had an injury history in Denver. The injury popped back up here with a torn ACL. You've given him a big dollar contract. I believe he's 29 and will turn 30 either in or shortly thereafter the next season. Jalen Phillips had a big injury history before he got drafted, and then now has had a calf injury, an oblique injury, a back injury, all with the Dolphins, and then a torn Achilles and a torn ACL. As great of a character guy he is off the field and as good of a player as he is on it, it just doesn't make good business sense to give him a contract until he can prove he stays healthy. And then at corner, Jalen Ramsey's 31, Kendall Fuller's 30, and you haven't gotten a damn thing out of Cam Smith. So while you've invested at these top premium positions, you've put high dollar contracts and high dollar resources into it, you haven't gotten much out of it, and you're going to have to start clearing that off of the books to build your team. And I know from a team source that they are painfully aware of their lack of youth and talent. They have 10 draft picks this year. They want more. And what's the best way to do that? I think it's to start offloading some of those assets, even if you take, cents on the dollar. Give yourself more cracks at the bat, more bites of the apple in the draft class this year to start restocking your shelves. Because even if you go back and look at the first draft with McDaniel and Grier, Channing Tindall has played 21 defensive snaps in 3 years, and I think those have come in 3 games. Eric Ezukama hasn't done a thing. Cameron Good has been a special teams player at best. Skylar Thompson's already gone. Kader Kohu, an undrafted free agent, is basically all you've gotten out of 2022. Cam Smith's a guy who really likes to party off the field, which is a misevaluation considering Chris Grier's son was his roommate at South Carolina, and he keeps getting hurt when he's on the field. Devon Achan's been a hit. Elijah Higgins is on a different roster, and Ryan Hayes has bounced back and forth to various practice squads, including the Dolphins, multiple times. This past draft was the first time you actually got multiple hits out of the same class. So, and I think you look at Tyreek Hill's comments on the Kay Adams show, which was a brilliant interview. Major props to Kay for kind of pressing him on the issues there. And, I feel like Tyreek's apology to the team and to Tua, being good soldier, that can be 50-50. Like, yeah, maybe he really does want to stay in Miami, but how much of that is Drew Rosenhaus saying, like, hey, here's an opportunity to go out, try and make amends and be a good soldier, and maybe that helps facilitate a trade more so than it does, rebuilding bridges in Miami. Maybe that makes it easier for the Dolphins to trade you. And I think it would benefit the Dolphins to trade Tyreek Hill, given that his $15 million roster bonus this year doesn't kick in until August 31st. If you can move him before the draft and clear that cap, even if you take a lesser asset, say you get a third or a third and a fifth or something like that, not as good as a second rounder, but the future value is good. And I think to some degree there's got to be some sort of survival mode that Chris Grier's in, where he's like, well, maybe I have to be realistic and realize I can't build a champion this year. And quick sidebar, if the goal here is to win a playoff game and check a box and call that mission accomplished, that's aiming way too low. I guess that's par for the course given the dire lack of accountability and standards around this organization. Don Shula would be rolling in his grave if he saw the current side of things. I thought Marino did a nice job of being PC on the Pat McAfee show. But there's a rotten fish smell emanating from Miami Gardens on this whole thing. And, I wonder how much business that Chris Grier can unwind and start to transition this roster into a younger roster while getting rid of some of these high-priced, high-leverage contracts and still keep himself in a job. I think that's the interesting thing I would like to watch, because there is a precedent for this being done in the league. You look at the Rams. Kyle Krabs made this point on his show. It was either early this past week or late the week before, but the Rams were, notoriously, fuck them picks. And now I think they've had like 20 rookies on the roster each of the last 2 years. they've done a tremendous job with their scouting department of basically turning over the old aging roster that won the Super Bowl after they had a down year, and now they're back in a tough division, contending for the division spot. They were 8 yards away from knocking off the Eagles, who were in the Super Bowl, and that's a young team outside of Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp, basically. So it can be done. I have next to zero faith that the Dolphins have the right people in place to do it, but it can be done. And I guess with that in mind, the thing that I'm very interested in seeing, because I don't have a good feeling about what Miami's win-loss record will be, and I have a pretty good feeling that I may get my wish that organizational change next year starts at the end of the 2025 season and includes Grier, McDaniel, and Tagovailoa. But for this year, I think I'll view it in a little bit more of a myopic lens, and we'll get into that in just a second. And before we get into that, I figured, why not do a new whiskey segment? And I'm currently on a whiskey side quest. So back in I think it was 1988, there was some Scottish council of distillers and vintners that got together, and it ended up being sort of a marketing ploy by the importer Diageo. But essentially, all these distilleries got together and they decided what's the quintessential classic single malt scotch from each of the regions. Highland, Speyside, Lowland, Islands, Isla. And I don't believe any of the Campbelltown distilleries were in operation at the time. They are now. I think there's 3. Glen Scotia, Springbank, and I'm forgetting the other one off the top of my head. But they did a West Highland. And I've been trying to collect the quintessential classic malts from each of those regions. And I've got a brand new one on the show tonight. So in my collection so far, I've had Lagavulin 16, which is the Isla classic malt. I've had that multiple times on the show. It's my favorite scotch. Same with Ron Swanson. The Island is Talisker 10, which I've had on the show. I've got bottles of both that and the Lagavulin currently in my collection. And then you had the West Highland is Oban 14, which I can get from my local liquor store. I just haven't done so yet. The Speyside is Cragganmore, and the Lowland is Glenkinchie. And the traditional Highland is the one I have now, which I've never had, which is Dalwhinnie 15, which brands itself as the gentle spirit. Now, being a Highland, you can expect the oak flavor from the casks and the traditional honey and heather, which on the nose, the Dalwhinnie, you get some apple, maybe a little pear mixed in there. And from what I've heard and what I've read about Dalwhinnie, it should be very honey flavored forward. So we'll give this one a shot here on Dolphins Talk Weekly. Yeah, the very, very much a honey flavor right off the bat. Almost reminds me of the candy bit of honey right off the bat. I don't really get much of the fruitiness of it. The honey is definitely the prominent flavor, and even though it says it's the gentle spirit is how they brand themselves, a little bit of a peppery finish that for a sweeter, candy-ish tasting scotch, that lasted a lot longer than I expected. I don't know. That one's kind of underrated to me. That's pretty good. I like it better than the Bunnahabhain 12, which I tried on the last episode. That one was more, you could tell the scotch had been finished in a port wine vat. This was just different than any scotch I've had. I would give this out of 5. I'll give it a 3.9. That was pretty good. A little sweet for my taste. Definitely different. More so what I would have expected from a Speyside than a Highland, but different in a good way. I would pick up a bottle if you can of that. Now, back to the draft at hand. I think one of the myopic view I want to take here is, we talked about this earlier in the show, Chris Grier, being the Parcellian disciple, has always traditionally focused on the big positions: quarterback, receiver, offensive tackle, D-end, corner. This year's draft class as a whole, those positions are not strengths other than corner. And I would say, well, let me preface this first. If you're looking for like prospect breakdowns and scouting reports of individual guys, I'm not the right show for that, especially not this year. I don't get to watch as much college football as I would like. Ever more, it's becoming the college football game just feels a little boring to me, because 90% of the teams are running the same offense, which isn't very deep. There's really only a handful of teams that are running good defense, although I will say that there is a lot more innovation within some of those good defenses at the college level than there is the NFL. You know, Georgia, Ohio State specifically, mostly Georgia. But this year's draft class, I think a lot of the media pundits will kind of play it down because this isn't a good quarterback class. This reminds me a lot of, I'm trying to remember the year and it's slowly escaping me. Is it 2007 when E.J. Manuel was the only quarterback taken by the Bills at like pick 17 or 18? This feels like that. You know, this quarterback class, I wouldn't want to touch. If I were the Titans, I'd be mad because if Cam Ward or Shadur Sanders is the top option, no. And I think from the Dolphins' perspective, you know, this may be a reason why they're not going to take that exit ramp on Tua's contract on March 14th. They're going to let that money guarantee because you have a lot more options in next year's class. So what I think here is the challenge for Chris Grier, and what I'll be curious to watch, and we'll do a free agency episode later on this. But for the draft class right now, the guts positions, the positions that the Dolphins traditionally don't invest top dollar or top assets into: running back, tight end, guard, D tackle, off-ball linebacker, safety. Those are the strengths of this draft class. And if you go back historically and look at Chris Grier's draft since he's taken over, okay, 2016, his first year, left tackle and a corner were his first two picks. Damn good first two picks, Laramie Tunsil and Xavier Howard. His second year, 2017, Charles Harris, pass rusher, first pick. Raekwon McMillan, off-ball linebacker, second pick, but that was kind of specific to the wide nine defense. And then a corner was the third-round pick, Cordray Tankersley. 2018, you can look at it and say, well, you know, Minkah Fitzpatrick was a safety, but that's not what he was drafted to play in Miami. They originally drafted him to play as a nickel. He did play 2 games as a free safety, and then they shifted him back to nickel and then moved him to outside corner. Then they had the coaching change, and Brian Flores wanted him as a slot player. It really wasn't until he became a Steeler that he became a full-fledged safety. You know, Mike Gesicki, more of a receiver than a tight end. You go to 2019, they finally took a defensive tackle, but I'd argue that that was more due to the fact that you're bringing in Brian Flores. You had this Patriot-style scheme, which relies heavily upon flexibility up front, and you didn't really have any bodies on the roster at D tackle, so you took Christian Wilkins. That's kind of the one example here where I think we're getting wonky, but again, it's more scheme-specific. You look at 2020, you took a quarterback, a tackle, and a corner. You drafted Rob Hunt as a tackle, and then you finally got another D tackle at the end of the second round. 2021, you took a wide receiver and a pass rusher. You know, Javon Holland is a safety, but again, in that scheme, kind of drafted to play a little bit of everywhere. Swiss Army knife, kind of slot player type of position. So Chris Grier, you know, kind of runs home to mama every chance he gets with these high picks and high dollar free agency contracts that he's given out, or the trades. You know, Teron Armstead got a big contract. Bradley Chubb was traded for. He's a D-end. Tyreek Hill traded for. That's a receiver. Jalen Ramsey, he traded for a corner. You get the theme. He's not going to really have that option this year at any of those top positions except for corner in the draft class. So the challenge for Chris Grier is, can he do what he so often never wants to do and draft those guts positions? You look at some of these spots, the Dolphins, you could potentially see Tyler Warren at 13. You shifted to a lot of 12 personnel after you cut OBJ and when Tua came back from the concussion. But, let's be optimistic, realistic. Durham Smythe and Julian Hill were not very good. If you drafted someone like Tyler Warren, that kind of changes the math for you offensively. Is he Brock Bowers? Is he Vernon Davis? No, but he's someone that can come in and play 700 to 800 snaps. You could look at it. Jonnu Smith is already 30. Maybe by year 2, he's playing 1,000 snaps and is sort of your George Kittle type of tight end. But there's other tight ends in the draft. Colston Loveland, Gunnar Helm, Mason Taylor, Mitchell Evans, Elijah Arroyo, Oscar Delp. The list goes on. Harold Fannin Jr. You've got options there. So I don't necessarily think you have to take a tight end. The tackle class up front, you've got a lot of guys with a lot of nits. Like this year's not a great left tackle class. But if you see a lot of those guys like Will Campbell, Kelvin Banks, Armand Membu, Donovan Jackson, all guys that Wyatt Milam, all guys, Gray Zabel, all guys that are tackles that could probably slide inside. You see that guard and center class really kind of take a shine to it. And would you draft another tackle, especially if Teron Armstead comes back? And it does sound like, based on some reporting from Josh Mosher, that Armstead does want to come back and is willing to play ball financially to have a contract commensurate of both the level of play and the quantity of games he's playing on hand. So be on the lookout for that. The defensive tackle class is absolutely loaded. You can take your pick. If the Dolphins want another player that could potentially replace Zach Sealer down the road, or, you could play multiple guys in sort of these over-under heavy end fronts that you have. Mason Graham from Michigan, Walter Nolan from Ole Miss are 2-3 techniques that are really good. You've got guys like Shamar Stewart and Darius Alexander who can play inside or can step out and be a heavy end for you. Kind of the same goes with Derek Harmon from Oregon. You've got other guys like TJ Sanders and Josh Farmer from South Carolina and Florida State that are kind of quintessential 3 techniques. CJ West from Indiana can probably play as like a 1. But then you've also got this wonderful class of big nose tackles, and maybe one of my favorite players in the entire class, Kenneth Grant from Michigan. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this on the show, but I did some work for Pro Football Focus on the college side last summer, and one of the evaluations I got to do was the Michigan defense from that year. Kenneth Grant might be a better pro than Mason Graham. He's an absolute freak show, 6'3", 335, 340, but he can move. He's not just a true nose tackle. You could play him anywhere from a 2-eye to a 3 technique, and he could probably give you some flexibility as playing as a heavy 3 or a 4-eye if you really wanted to muscle up against a heavy run team. I think the issue with Kenneth Grant is he's a nose tackle. He's not going to eat a ton of your snaps. For reference, Benito Jones played like 48% last year. But the problem is you're probably not going to get a second swing of the bat at him. You're going to have to take him at 13. The good news is there's other guys like Tyreek Williams from Ohio State, Deion Walker from Kentucky, Alfred Collins from Texas, Jamari Caldwell from Oregon, Jordan Phillips from Maryland, that are all right there. Another one of my favorite players in the draft, and I know Chris Grier's long had an affinity for Georgia guys, so I would expect a lot of people to start whispers about Mykel Williams, the defensive end from Georgia, or Jalen Walker, who can play off-ball linebacker and be a blitzer, which may really appeal to Anthony Weaver in this defense. And now I think Anthony Weaver's pretty much a lock to stay at this point. But if you really want to make a temperature change on defense, Jahad Campbell from Alabama is an incredibly fun player to watch. He's big, 6'3", 240, 245. Was a very good receiver in high school. Was recruited to Alabama to be a pass rusher. Didn't really put on weight the way they thought and kind of shifted him to off-ball linebacker, and he took it to like a duck to water. He's a phenomenal player. I would take him at 13 and not think twice about it, but the Dolphins don't seem to value off-ball linebackers like that. Now, I do think Jalen Walker's a damn good player in his own right, and I'd be pretty damn happy with either of them. You've got some options there later, though. Jeffrey Bassa from Oregon, Demetrius Knight from South Carolina, Carson Schlesinger from UCLA. Or is it Corey Schlesinger? I don't remember. The UCLA kid named Schlesinger is pretty damn good. You've got options there at that spot. Kind of the same deal with safety. You've got Nick Eamon-Warry, who I think is big, but he's super rangy. You've got Malachi Starks, who, probably going to get linked to the Dolphins. Xavier Watts from Notre Dame, Lathan Ransom from Ohio State, Andrew Mukuba from Texas. All guys I think are probably going in the top 3 rounds that can help you build that room. Now, if you're going to ask me, do the Dolphins, do they go to one of these premium positions? I'd be fine with Mykel Williams. I think he's a damn good player. And if you take someone like that to pair with Chop Robinson as your 2 starting pass rushers of the future, if you want to move off of Chubb and Phillips after 2025, I'm fine with it. The cornerback class is really good. Will Johnson from Michigan in particular, I think his body of work on film is better than Travis Hunter, even though Travis Hunter is probably going to test better than Will Johnson. You look at the game that Travis Hunter had against Tet McMillan, the receiver from Arizona, and kind of gets torn up, whereas Will Johnson has played against better competition on a more consistent basis and just been a stalwart the entire way through. Jahdae Barron from Texas is really good. Azareye'h Thomas from Florida State, Benjamin Morrison from Notre Dame, Maxwell Hairston from Kentucky. All guys I really like there. If you're going to go to one of those tried and true positions, the pass rusher, about the only one that feels right at that range for me is Mykel Williams. Now, maybe they take a liking to Mike Green, the kid from Marshall, who, basically is a clone of Will Anderson, who went very high to the Texans. I think he was the 3rd overall pick a couple years ago, right after they took C.J. Stroud. Sorry, we need another sip of the Dow Winnie there. But I think where this draft class is strong are spots that the Dolphins typically don't invest top picks in. But I think in order to finally get this roster where you're going, you need to start focusing on those types of positions and being open to just taking really good players rather than trying to force fit positions or adhering to guys from schools you like. Channing Tindall over Leo Chenal comes to mind here. Minkah Fitzpatrick over Derwin James comes to mind back from 2018. Some of those types of decisions have kind of bit Chris Grier in the ass. And I think you almost need to see him kind of freewheel it the way he did his first draft with Tunsil and Xavier Howard. Those might be his 2 best picks of his entire tenure at this rate. So I think in a vacuum, Chris Grier is a pretty good evaluator of talent. He's just not a good builder of a roster. And you look at what the Dolphins did last year in free agency, and you found some hits with limited dollars to spend. Jonnu Smith set 2 franchise records as a tight end. Aaron Brewer was probably your most consistent lineman from start to finish of the season. Calais Campbell played really well for someone who's 39 and still ate 52% of the snaps. Jordan Brooks was the best linebacker we've had since Carlos Dansby, which is essentially saying He's the best linebacker we've had since Zach Thomas was on the team. Kendall Fuller was pretty good, had 4 separate injury instances, 2 concussions, a shoulder and a knee. So he may not be long for the roster, but he at least was good. You didn't really have a ton of misses outside of Odell Beckham Jr. just being a shit show. And like I said before, you found some nice talent in the draft. Chop Robinson was one of the 5 finalists for Defensive Rookie of the Year. He led all the rookie defensive ends in sacks, second among all rookies in sacks. Only Braden Fisk, the D tackle from Florida State who went to the Rams, had more. Chop Robinson was top 30 in pressures in the entire league amongst all defensive positions. So that's defensive ends, outside linebackers, D tackles, a couple safeties made the list. So you got a nice player in Chop Robinson, and that's a piece to build on. I think Patrick Paul, while the tape is not ever going to remind you of like Anthony Munoz, Walter Jones, or Joe Thomas, or even Teron Armstead for that matter, it's still pretty effective outside of the game he had against Myles Garrett. But I feel like that's one of those where you kind of expected what you got. But his performance against Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter in the Houston game, again, it doesn't look pretty, but it was pretty damn efficient. I think gives me some hope that there's a pretty good player in there if you can kind of get him to have his body better built and keep adding to his technique. Jaylen Wright looked good in the games he got extensive run. I don't know why they went away from him the way they did, but got extensive run. Malik Washington, for a 6th round pick, turned into a pretty nice kick and punt returner. Had the most catches on anyone on the team after Hill, Waddle, and Jonnu Smith, which I think some people, myself included, probably expected, but I think he's probably your top slot option, regardless of what happens with Tyreek Hill going into 2025. So I think the Dolphins need to have another season like that. I don't consistently trust them to have success in the draft, which is why I'm advocating, and I think they acknowledge internally they need more picks, and they should try and get more picks this year to give themselves more bites at the apple. So that's the challenge and what I want to see in this draft season as we get, what are we, 2.5 months away at this point. That's what I'd like to see the Dolphins do. At least win some of these small battles, because you're going to lose this war in the 2025 season, and I think heads are going to roll. But at least get some small victories along the way and help stock the shelves for the next guys. I think you can do it in free agency as well, and we'll have a show on that coming up in the next week or two. I will be in Indianapolis on the Tuesday, the week of the Combine, to meet up with some friends who work in various league circles, and I'll share what intel I can from that sojourn into Indianapolis. But that's going to do it for the show here. So bear that in mind as we get close to this draft season, that this is a draft that may force the Dolphins to do what they normally don't do. And I think going full-blown George Costanza might as well just be the best strategy at this point, because Chris Grier talks about the process that he's confident in. The process has delivered you tangibly fucking nothing for 10 years. Just go Costanza on it. Do what doesn't feel natural to you, is kind of my message to the Dolphins. Win some of these small battles through guerrilla warfare instead of whatever it is they were trying to accomplish these past 9 years with Grier in charge. That's the show. Please follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on DolphinsTalk.com, Spotify, iTunes, wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Check out the other writers and shows on the DolphinsTalk.com network. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll be back with another episode within the next week or two.